The dress was wrong, and Jolie knew it the second she walked through the doors. Not wrong in the way her mother meant it. Not cheap, not shapeless, not the wrong shade of blue for someone with her complexion, whatever that meant. It was wrong because every other woman in the Hargrove Grand's ballroom was wearing something that cost more than Jolie's monthly rent. And the fabric of her dress, bought on clearance at a department store 2 weeks ago, caught the chandelier light differently, flatly, like it was embarrassed for her. She stopped at the top of the entrance stairs and took a breath. The ballroom below her was the kind of room that made you feel your own smallness before anyone said a word. Gold everywhere. White flowers the size of dinner plates arranged in vases taller than she was. Men in suits that moved like second skin. Women in gowns that whispered when they walked. The kind of event her father had spent 30 years pretending he belonged to. Spending money he didn't have to stand in rooms like this one, shaking hands with men who forgot his name by morning. She started down the stairs. She made it 6 steps before she heard Diane. "Oh, Jolie." Her half-sister's voice carried the way it always did, designed to carry, trained since childhood to reach exactly as far as it needed to. "Honey." Diane was at the base of the stairs with 2 of her friends, a glass of champagne angled perfectly in one hand, her gown a deep burgundy that made her look like she had been born for exactly this room. She was looking at Jolie's dress the way someone looks at a stain on a tablecloth right before an important dinner, with genuine pity, almost tender with it. "That color," Diane said softly, tilting her head. "It's very brave of you." Her friends smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes because it doesn't need to. Jolie kept walking down the stairs. "Diane, Dad's been asking about you." Diane fell into step beside her at the bottom, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel like confidence, loud enough to still be heard. "I told him you'd probably be late. You always are. I didn't think you'd actually show up like." She gestured vaguely at Jolie's entire body. I wasn't planning to come at all," Jolie said. "Then why did you?" "Because he called. Because he sounded like he was drowning, and she was the only one who ever picked up the phone, even when she knew better, even when she told herself she was done picking up. Because she was 31 years old, and she still couldn't let her father fall without trying to catch him, no matter how many times he'd dropped her first. She didn't say any of that. "Because it's his name on the invitation," she said instead, and kept walking. She found her father at the far end of the room near the bar, shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize, already into his 2nd or 3rd drink by the color in his face. Gerald Vane. Not vain like she was, she'd taken her mother's name at 17, looked smaller every time she saw him, like the years were compressing him. He caught her eye over the stranger's shoulder, and the relief on his face was so naked it hurt to look at. She waited. When he got free, he came to her and gripped both her hands and said quietly, "You look wonderful, Joe." He was lying. He'd always been a kind liar, which was somehow worse than the other kind. "Dad," she kept her voice low, "tell me why I'm actually here." He looked past her shoulder, scanning the room. Something pinched around his eyes that she recognized. The same expression he'd had when the business started going under 6 years ago, when the letters started arriving, when he'd started making phone calls at strange hours and hanging up quickly when she walked into the room. "There are some people I need to speak with tonight," he said. "Business, some things got complicated. I needed you here, Joe. In case what?" He didn't answer. He pressed her hands once and drifted back toward the bar, and she stood there in her clearance dress, in the middle of a room full of people who didn't know her name, thinking about the drive home. How long it would take. Whether she could leave before dinner was served without it meaning something to him. She got a glass of water from a passing tray and found a column near the east wall and stood next to it. From here she could see the whole room. It was a habit she'd developed working late nights in small accounting offices. Always know your exits, always know where the numbers don't add up, always know which direction things are about to fall before they start falling. The room shifted at 9:47. She noticed it before she understood it. A change in the way people were standing. A subtle gravitational pull toward the main entrance. Bodies angling without meaning to. conversations tapering off mid-sentence. The kind of thing that happens when someone walks into a room who makes other rooms feel smaller by comparison. She turned. He came in without announcement, which was its own kind of announcement. Two men flanked him at a distance that was too precise to be casual. Positioned, she realized. Like brackets around a number you didn't want anyone else touching. The man himself was somewhere in his early 40s, she thought, though he wore it the way stone wears weather. Not softened by it, just marked. Dark suit, no tie. The kind of face that had been handsome once and was still handsome, but in a way that had nothing to do with youth anymore. A scar ran from just below his left ear to the corner of his jaw, and he hadn't done anything to conceal it. He stood just inside the entrance and looked at the room like he was reading a balance sheet. Diane materialized at the edge of her vision, straightening. Even from across the room, Jolie could see her half-sister recalibrate, the way she always did when something worth wanting walked in. The man, she didn't know his name yet, only that the room had rearranged itself for him, spoke briefly to one of the men beside him, and then moved into the crowd. People stepped aside without being asked. A conversation dissolved as he passed through it. A woman near the champagne table touched her collarbone. Jolie turned back to her water glass. She wasn't here for this. She was here because her father had sounded like he was drowning, and she was here to figure out how deep the water was and whether she could pull him out of it again. And then she was going to get in her car and drive home and eat something over the sink and go to bed. She was not here to watch a room full of adults perform for a man in a dark suit. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, just the quiet. The specific absence of ambient sound that happens when someone stops a few feet behind you and the people around them register it before you do. She turned around. He was closer than she expected. Not inappropriately close, just closer than she would have predicted for a man who had the entire room to move through. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not the usual kind she got at events like this, which ranged from dismissive to politely blank. This was something more like assessment. Careful and impersonal, the way you look at a column of figures before you start checking them. "You've been standing in the same place for 23 minutes, he said. She blinked. "Excuse me? Since 9:24. He glanced at the room briefly and then back at her. "You clocked every exit in the first 4 minutes. You've tracked 6 different conversations without appearing to participate in any of them. And you're drinking water at a champagne event." Jolie looked at him for a long moment. "Are you describing surveillance?" she said. "Or is this a very specific pickup line?" Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement. More like the ghost of it, passing through. "Neither." He extended a hand, briefly. "Callum Vore." She shook it. Firm, brief. "Jolie, just Jolie, for now." He looked at her again in that same assessing way. Up close she could see the weariness in his face, not the performative fatigue of someone who wanted you to know they were busy, but something older and quieter than that, the kind that settled into the bones. He had the hands of someone who worked, or had worked once, before he had people to do his working for him. "Your father," he said, "is Gerald Vane." It was not a question. The glass of water suddenly felt very deliberate in her hand. "What business do you have with my father, Miss Vore?" His debt. She'd known something was wrong. She'd known it from the phone call, from the way he'd said her name, from the relief on his face when she walked in. She'd known and she'd come anyway, because she always came anyway, because 31 years hadn't been long enough to teach her the lesson her mother had learned in 15. "How much?" she said flatly. "Enough that the number would alarm you." "Try me. I do numbers for a living." He studied her. 240,000. The chandelier light didn't waver. The music didn't skip. Nothing in the room acknowledged that the floor had just tilted under her feet. She kept her face even, kept the water glass steady, looked at Callum Vore and did the math without being asked. Interest rate, timeline, her father's income, what he owned, what he owed, what was left. Nothing was left. "He borrowed from you," she said, "from my organization." She absorbed that. And tonight? Tonight he was supposed to finalize an arrangement, a property transfer. His building on Clement Street. Vore's voice was completely uninflected, the way numbers are uninflected. They don't care what they describe. He doesn't have the deed, because he'd already borrowed against the building 3 years ago. She knew that. She'd seen his taxes. She'd told him then, sitting across from him at his kitchen table, "Dad, you can't." And he'd said he knew he was handling it, and she'd believed him because she always believed him one more time. "The deed is in his ex-wife's name," Jolie said. "Partial interest. She never signed it over. He can't transfer what he doesn't fully own." Vore looked at her, a long, quiet look. "You knew that before you walked in tonight. I suspected it the moment you said his name." She set the water glass on the tray of a passing server. "Which means the arrangement he promised you tonight was never going to close. Which means you're going to want something else." "Yes." "What?" "That depends," Vore said, "on what he has." "He has me," she said, before she fully understood that she was saying it. "He has a daughter who has spent the last 8 years untangling other people's financial disasters. I'm a forensic accountant, Mr. Vore. I find the places where money disappears." She held his gaze. "I'm guessing a man in your business has some of those." The room kept going around them. Diane was somewhere to the left. Jolie could feel the weight of her attention like a hand on the back of her neck. Her father was at the bar, drinking, not watching. Because watching would mean he'd have to know what was happening, and knowing things had never been Gerald Vane's strongest suit. Vore was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. "You'd work for me," he said. It wasn't skepticism. It was something more like someone reading a contract clause twice to make sure they understood it. "To clear his debt," Jolie said. "Yes. You don't know what that work looks like. I know what missing money looks like. I know what cooked books look like. I know what it looks like when someone inside an organization is skimming, and I know how they hide it, and I know how to find it." She kept her voice even. "You're not the first powerful man with a money problem I've sat across a table from, Mr. Vore. You're just the most direct one." Something shifted in his face. The assessment sharpened into something she didn't have a word for. "Monday," he said, 9 o'clock, 41st and Harbour, the building with the green awning. Ask for Vore. He didn't say if you decide. He didn't say think about it. He said it the way someone writes a number in a ledger. Done, recorded. Final. He turned to go. "Mr. Vore." She said it before she meant to. He stopped, turned back halfway. "The man standing near the bar by the south window," Jolie said quietly. "In the grey suit. He's been watching you since you walked in. Not the way the rest of the room has been watching you. Different. Like he's waiting for something." Vore didn't look toward the bar. He kept his eyes on her face. "He came in through the side entrance," she added. 20 minutes before you arrived. He spoke to the event coordinator for exactly 90 seconds and then positioned himself there. He has no drink. He hasn't moved." The quiet between them changed texture. "What's your name?" said all of it. "Jolie Kessler." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "Monday," and walked away. She watched him cross the room. She watched the 2 men at his flanks register the man by the bar without looking at him directly, the way water flows around an obstacle. She watched Vore pause briefly to speak to a white-haired man near the string quartet, and then move toward the exit, unhurried the way someone moves when they've already accounted for every variable. Diane appeared at her elbow. "Was that?" Diane started, and then stopped, because she'd seen his face clearly now that he was moving away. "Did Callum Vore just talk to you briefly?" "About what?" Jolie picked up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray. "Business." Diane made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Jolie, honey, men like that don't do." She waved her free hand, champagne tilting. "Business with. Have a nice evening, Diane." She walked away. She found her father before she left and told him quietly that she'd spoken to someone about the Clement Street situation, and she'd handle it, and he needed to stop borrowing money from people he couldn't pay back. He looked at her with those wet, grateful eyes and said she was a good girl. She'd always been his good girl, and she told him to drink some water and took a cab home. She sat on her fire escape in the dark and looked at the street below and ran the numbers in her head. Forensic work for an organization like Vore's would be exactly what she'd said it would be. Finding the places where money went quiet, tracing it back to its source, naming it. She was good at that. She'd done it for 3 different law firms and a county prosecutor's office, and once, memorably, for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, whose CFO had been skimming for 11 years before she found the thread and pulled it. She was good at finding threads. She told herself that was why she said yes. Because she was good at it, because it was the math that made sense, his debt, her skills, a clean transaction, not because of the way Callum Vore had looked at her like she was a problem worth solving, not because of anything else. Monday, she was at the building on 41st at 8:47. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the green awning and thought about her mother, who had known when to walk away. She thought about her father, who had never learned. She thought about the number 240,000 and what it had done to the expression on Vore's face when she'd offered it herself instead of the deed. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Something more like recalculation. She went inside. The man at the desk looked up and she said, "I'm here for Vore," and he reached for the phone without another word. Vore's offices were on the 7th floor, which was not what she expected. She'd expected somewhere higher, somewhere that felt more deliberately inaccessible. The 7th floor was just an office, clean, spare, with windows that looked out over the harbor, a desk that held exactly what it needed to and nothing else, a chair across from it, which was where she was directed to sit. He came in 4 minutes after she did, which was also not what she expected. She'd expected to be made to wait. He sat across from her and put a file on the desk between them and said, 3 months of discrepancies. March through May. The money surfaces and then disappears before it gets to the next account, somewhere in a window of 72 to 96 hours. She pulled the file toward her and opened it. The numbers were not clean, deliberately not clean. Someone had made them look almost right, which was worse than looking obviously wrong. Almost right took effort. Almost right took someone who knew what right looked like. "This is inside work," she said without looking up. "Yes, someone with access to the primary ledger. Or someone who was given access," he said. "The list is short, 4 people." She looked up. "You already know which 4. I have theories, but you haven't moved on them. Not without something I can prove." He leaned back in his chair, watching her. "I don't move on theories." She looked back at the file. March, April, May. The pattern was almost elegant if you didn't know what you were looking at. A slow drain, calibrated to stay below the threshold of obvious loss. Someone patient. Someone methodical. Someone who didn't know that the pattern itself was the fingerprint. "I'll need the full account records," she said. 3 years back, not 3 months. Whoever did this has been building toward this. The window you can see is the execution. I need to find the rehearsal." Vore was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant amount of internal documentation," he said. She met his eyes. "You want the name or you want to protect the paperwork?" The room was very still. "I'll have it sent to you by end of day," he said. She nodded and looked back at the file. Outside the harbor window, a container ship was moving slowly across the water, enormous and quiet, carrying whatever it carried to wherever it was going. She thought about her father with his wet, grateful eyes. She thought about $240,000. She thought about the dress she'd worn on Saturday and what Diane's face had looked like when Vore walked away from her. She pulled a notepad from her bag and uncapped her pen. "I work better with context," she said without looking up. "Tell me what the money is supposed to do when it moves correctly. I need to understand the structure before I can identify where it breaks." There was a pause. "Most people who sit in that chair," Vore said, "don't ask about the structure. Most people who sit in that chair," she said, "aren't trying to find your leak. They're trying to survive the room." She looked up. "I'm not afraid of the room, Mr. Vore. I'm interested in the numbers." He looked at her for a long moment, tired around the edges, like she'd noticed at the Hargrove. Like the weight of the organization he carried was not something he'd ever put down long enough to forget how much it weighed, but something behind the tiredness, something more alert than the rest of his face, was paying close attention. The money moves in cycles, he said. 14 days. It originates here, clears through 3 holding accounts, and arrives at distribution by the 15th of each month. He paused, or it did, until March. She wrote that down. They worked for 3 hours. She asked questions, and he answered them with a precision she hadn't expected. He knew his own organization the way she knew a set of books, completely, from memory, the way you know something you've built and watched and worried over for years. She wrote everything down. She stopped him twice to clarify. He didn't show impatience either time. At the end of the 3rd hour, she put her pen down and looked at what she had. The 14th, she said, that's when it happens. Not the 15th when you notice it's short. The 14th, the day before. Someone with access to the secondary account makes a transfer that looks like an internal reallocation. It's been coded as overhead in the ledger. Overhead doesn't get audited the same way income does. Vore was very still. It's sitting in an overhead line, she said, marked as facility maintenance. 3 months of it. If I have the 3-year record, I'll find the smaller tests they ran before March, probably coded differently. Building supplies, insurance adjustments. She looked at him. Who codes your overhead? He said a name. She wrote it down. I need the full records to confirm, she said, but that's where I'd start. He stood. She'd noticed that he didn't make small movements. When he stood completely, the same way he'd walked into the Hargrove, like his body was accustomed to occupying space deliberately. He moved to the window and looked out at the harbor for a moment with his back to her. You found in 3 hours what my people didn't find in 3 months, he said. Your people were probably looking for the money, Jolie said. I looked for the pattern. The money goes wherever someone takes it. The pattern stays. He turned back from the window. In the harbor light, he looked like himself, marked and tired and more awake than he wanted you to know. He looked at her the way he had at the Hargrove, standing at the base of the stairs, while Diane's voice carried across the room, and every head turned toward the entrance, and Jolie stood against a column and drank water and watched the exits. Like she was a column of figures he hadn't expected to balance. The debt, he said, your father's. She waited. Consider it restructured, he said. Based on today, I haven't confirmed anything yet. No, he said, but you will. He picked up the file from the desk. The records will be here tomorrow morning. I'll expect your findings within 2 weeks. He moved toward the door, and she gathered her notepad and her pen and stood. Mr. Vore, he stopped. The man from the Gala, she said. The one by the bar. Did you find out who sent him? A pause. We're looking into it, he said, and something in his voice was different than it had been. How did you know he was a problem and not just a guest? She considered how to explain it. The way numbers had a feel to them when they were wrong. Not obviously wrong, but off, a fraction of a degree out of alignment that you only caught if you knew what level looked like. He was the only person in the room, she said, who wasn't watching you because you impressed him. He was watching you because you were the variable he was waiting to see move. Vore stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. 2 weeks, Miss Kessler, he said, and then he was gone, and she was standing in his office with the harbor spread out behind her, and a notepad full of numbers and the specific, quiet feeling she always got when she found the first thread and felt it give. She had 2 weeks. She was going to need 4 days.